When it comes to the current state of psychology, there's certainly a lot of good that's been done. But in other ways, it's like medieval medicine before the advent of the scientific method, right? There's a lot of misplaced confidence and groping in the dark, right? Like, okay, we're now describing this with authority, but they don't have any idea what they're talking about, or that, that they're taking something very big and trying to make it really small. And of course, there's plenty of incentives within academia to do that. But at least one way of not a comprehensive understanding of human consciousness by any stretch, but part of the way we can begin to understand the answer to your question is that humans, there are many sources of our consciousness. Part of it is from our biology, right? That is, whether we're grumpy depends on whether we had something to, had our dinner. And there's this whole field of evolutionary psychology that's arisen to try to explain how our bodies and the adaptations to the Pleistocene environment of our ancient ancestors, construct our psychology in the moment. And I think there's something to that. I think clearly that there's biological elements or influences on what we would call our consciousness. There's also cultural influences, right? Of course, it's this nature and nurture. We're in this realm, and we form an identity, and then those identities, for the most part, are on offer as subsets of these larger cultural structures, right? So, who are you? I'm a religious person, or I'm a scientific person, or I'm a woke person. Right? These things help define the cultural consciousness, and if we understand that cultural consciousness as these literal intersubjective systems that are interpenetrating our minds, and in some cases, thinking our thoughts for us. Again, I would say in between these larger influences of biology and culture, there's degrees of human freedom. And as our consciousness evolves and grows, that freedom increases, right? So we're not just slaves to whatever culture we belong to, or slaves to our biological impulses, but we're in charge increasingly as to which cultural structures we choose to identify with and which biological urges we choose to suppress. So understanding the impact of cultural consciousness helps us appreciate that how can we understand what it is that's going to cause people to move up to more inclusive forms of consciousness or more evolved cultural identities, and those, a lot of it has to do with how the culture itself moves. So for most people, until there's another worldview that they can identify with, it's really difficult to break out of that existing worldview. And so when modernity emerged, there was this invitation to a new worldview, especially in the French Revolution. It was in a sense summarized by the slogan "Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity." Right? That was the watchword that invited people to throw off the shackles of the ancient regime and embrace this new sense of brotherhood that came from equality and liberty and individualism that was a big part of the modernist emergence. And then I also mentioned turn on, tune, and drop out as a similar kind of sloganeering invitation to join a new worldview. Even though that worldview had been growing in the womb, so to speak, for decades, even more than 100 years, since the Transcendentalists, right, or earlier expressions of proto-postmodernism. Until there's a next cultural emergence, it's going to be very difficult for people to break out of those other worldviews. Nevertheless, there are transition triggers. And so to just make it as plain as possible, a lot of those have to do with the accumulation of existential problems that can't be solved, right? It's a cliche to cite Einstein, right? Some problems can't be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. So, for example, typically, as people raised in a traditionally religious household go to college, they might learn about all these different ways of thinking. And in the past especially, that represented a trigger because it problematized a mythic worldview to the point where a rational worldview solved problems that couldn't be solved within the traditional cultural structure. Likewise, with modernity, problems start to accumulate. I mentioned the emptiness of seeking status and material, but also problems with the fact that trying to find a way to explain how consciousness emerges from the brain, the very question itself is part of the problem because it presupposes an answer which is false. And so the accumulating existential problems and contradictions that can't be solved within that purview begin to become a transition trigger for some. And we can see similar existential problems within progressive postmodernism. I mentioned its political impotency, but also, the extent to which its values are dependent upon a kind of an angry militancy, the culture of outrage. People can't sustain that, at least not most. So the idea that the enemy is not as evil as perhaps, with Trump about to be elected, we'll see, who knows, that fans the flames of this black and white. He is, especially for progressive postmodernism, but for good thinking people across the political spectrum, his negatives and pathologies are seen as a validation for their us versus them worldview. But because, and this is an important point, one of the key values of progressive postmodernism is that it moves to a more fulsome world-centric morality, right, where everybody counts, right, especially those that have been victimized or marginalized. And this world-centric morality is noble and important and is going to be a necessary cultural achievement if we're going to create a world that works for everybody. But at the same time, this world-centric morality it's because it's so abstract. It's hard to generate political will. It's hard to give people a sense of strong identity in world centrism because, again, it's not very immediate. Whereas a more ethnocentric, meaning, our group in the broadest possible sense, right? Our group versus the out group. That's a much older form of social solidarity building. It taps into our evolutionary psychology more completely than world-centric morality. And so because progressive postmodernism has had a hard time generating, political will, political interest, momentum, movement with this world-centric morality, they found that in subtle ways that the more they become ethnocentric, the more that they rediscover an enemy, the more that they can motivate and draw people into their cultural sphere. And so